11 years. 11 years of showing up, and it took him 4 minutes to throw it all away. They said it wasn't personal. But nothing about losing everything ever feels like business. Everyone told him to start over safe. Nobody told him starting over could feel like coming home. No investors. No safety net. Just his grandmother's recipe, and a promise he refused to break. They fired the man. They never stood a chance against the legacy he was about to build.
If you have ever been told you were not good enough by someone who never once asked what you were carrying, this story is for you. Stay until the end, because what happens in the last 5 minutes will remind you why quitting was never an option. And if this story moves you even a little, hit like and subscribe, because stories like this deserve to be told, and you deserve to hear them. Marcus Reid had exactly 4 minutes to get to the 7th floor. He knew this because he had counted the seconds in the elevator so many times over the past 11 years that the ride itself had become a kind of prayer. 42 seconds, if the doors closed fast. A minute 10, if someone on 3 held the button. He straightened his tie in the reflection of the brushed steel doors, smoothed down a stubborn cowlick with his palm, and reminded himself, the way he did every single morning, that he was not just Marcus Reid, regional operations manager. He was Zoe's father, and Zoe's father did not get to have bad days, because bad days had a way of turning into bad weeks, and bad weeks had a way of turning into missed rent. He had been at Callaway Foods for 11 years. He had started in the warehouse, loading pallets of flour and sugar onto trucks at 4 in the morning, before anyone else in the building had even poured their first coffee. He had worked his way, inch by stubborn inch, into logistics, then into regional operations, learning the business the way some men learn scripture, cover to cover, footnote by footnote, until he understood every gear that turned inside the company better than the men who had inherited their positions. He had done this while raising a daughter alone, ever since Alicia passed when Zoe was 4, taking with her the only softness Marcus had ever let himself lean on. Alicia used to be the one who remembered permission slips and dentist appointments and the exact brand of strawberry shampoo that wouldn't make Zoe cry during bath time. After she was gone, Marcus had to learn all of it overnight, in the space between grief and 6 a.m. alarms, teaching himself patience the way he had once taught himself supply chain. Spreadsheets, slowly, imperfectly, and with nobody grading his progress except a 4-year-old who just wanted her hair braided before preschool. He never remarried, never really dated, because there hadn't been room in his days for anything beyond work and Zoe, and because some quiet part of him worried that giving his heart to someone new might somehow mean giving up the space in it that still belonged entirely to Alicia. He had done it while coaching Zoe's rec league soccer team on Saturdays, while learning to braid hair from grainy phone videos at 11 at night, while showing up to 8 a.m. meetings on 4 hours of sleep with a smile stitched onto his face, because a black man in a corner office had to smile twice as hard to be seen as calm instead of angry. The elevator doors opened onto the 7th floor, and Marcus felt it before he saw it. That particular silence that settles over an office when everyone already knows something you don't do. Heads dipped a fraction too fast toward computer screens. A co-worker named Denise offered him a smile that didn't reach her eyes. And there, waiting outside the glass-walled corner office, with a manila folder tucked under his arm like a weapon he was eager to use, stood Richard Callaway III, CEO, third-generation heir to a company his grandfather had built from a single flour mill, and a man who had never in his life had to count the seconds in an elevator. Marcus, good, you're here. Come in. Let's make this quick. Richard did not offer coffee. He did not offer a seat. Not really. He gestured at the chair the way a man gestures at a crosswalk, an obligation rather than an invitation. We're restructuring the Western region. Effective today, your position is being eliminated. He slid the folder across the desk without meeting Marcus's eyes. It's not personal, Marcus. It's just business. Marcus had heard those 5 words before, from other men, in other rooms, but never with his daughter's kindergarten photo still sitting in a frame on the corner of a desk. He would clear out within the hour. He looked at the severance number on the page. 6 weeks. For a man who had given the company 11 years and had, more than once, driven through snowstorms to keep the Denver distribution center running so that Richard Calloway III could make his golf tee time without a single supply chain headache. Marcus did not raise his voice. He had learned a long time ago that raising his voice in that building would be remembered as anger, while Richard raising his voice would be remembered as passion. 11 years, Marcus said quietly. And it's not personal. The market doesn't care about years, Marcus. It cares about margins. Richard finally looked up, and there was something almost bored in his expression, the look of a man reciting a line he had used before and would use again. Security will help you with your things. Marcus stood, buttoned his jacket out of a habit older than the insult he had just absorbed, and walked out past the same desks where he had trained half the department, past Denise's not-quite eye contact, into an elevator that, for the first time in 11 years, he did not need to count the seconds for. He had nowhere left to rush to. He picked Zoe up from school that afternoon in his work clothes, because he hadn't known what else to wear to carry a secret that big. She climbed into the passenger seat, backpack still half-zipped, gap-toothed grin already halfway to a story about her science fair volcano, and Marcus realized, watching her buckle her seatbelt with the fierce independence of a 9-year-old who insisted she didn't need help anymore, that whatever came next, it could not be about him. It had to be about her. That night, after Zoe was asleep, Marcus sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and did the math he had been avoiding for years. 6 weeks of severance, a mortgage, a car payment, a daughter who needed braces in 18 months and had no idea her father's stomach had been in knots since 3 o'clock that afternoon. He thought about updating his resume, about the LinkedIn message he'd already drafted and deleted 4 times, about sending it out into a market that, as Richard had so gently reminded him, did not care about years. And then he thought about his grandmother's hands. Ruth Reid had run a bakery out of the back of her house in Charleston for 31 years before. Arthritis finally took her wrists away from her. Marcus had spent every summer of his childhood standing on an overturned milk crate beside her, elbow deep in dough, learning the difference between a proof and an overproof by smell alone, learning that bread, unlike men, never lied about what it needed. She used to say, flour dusted across her forearms like a second skin, "Baby, a man can build an empire, but if he never learns to feed people with his own 2 hands, he ain't built nothing at all." Marcus hadn't thought about that bakery in years. He hadn't let himself. In the days that followed, Marcus did what he had always done. He made a plan. He sat with 3 different bankers, each of them polite in that careful, distant way that told him more than their words did. One suggested he consider a smaller loan for something more manageable, like a food truck. Another asked him, without quite asking, whether he had a business partner with more capital. The question hanging in the air, with an implication Marcus had heard his whole professional life, that a black man with a good idea needed someone else's name on the paperwork before the idea could be trusted. He kept every rejection letter in a folder on the passenger seat of his truck, not out of bitterness, but because his grandmother had also taught him that a closed door was information, not a verdict. 2 weeks later, driving Zoe to a birthday party across town, Marcus passed a squat brick building on the corner of 5th and Larkin with a faded, hand-painted sign that read, Golden Crust Bakery, EST, 1962, and a for sale sign taped crooked in the window, like it had given up trying to look hopeful. He slowed the car without meaning to. Zoe, in the back seat, asked why they'd stopped. Marcus didn't have an answer yet, but something in his chest had, for the first time since that glass-walled office, stopped clenching. He called the number on the sign before he let himself think better of it. The bakery had been closed for 3 years. The previous owner, an elderly man named Sal, who had run it since the 70s, had passed away, and his children, scattered across 3 different states and with no interest in flour or ovens, just wanted it gone. The building smelled like dust and old butter, and something underneath that Marcus could only describe as memory. The ovens were ancient. The wiring was a fire marshal's nightmare, and half the tile floor had buckled from a roof leak nobody had bothered to fix. It would take almost every dollar of his severance, plus a small business loan Marcus wasn't sure he'd even qualify for, plus every ounce of sweat equity he had left in his body. He signed the papers on a Tuesday in March, sitting across from a loan officer who asked him, not unkindly, if he was sure about this. A man his age, leaving a stable corporate salary for a business with a 90% failure rate in its first 5 years. Marcus thought about Richard Calloway's bored expression, about the phrase, "It's not personal," about 11 years of proving himself to people who had decided the answer before he ever walked in the room. "I've never been more sure of anything," Marcus said. The first month of renovation nearly broke him. He learned to rewire outlets from YouTube tutorials at midnight, his hands shaking with exhaustion. Zoe asleep on a sleeping bag in the corner of what would become the front counter because the babysitter had canceled, and Marcus refused to leave her home alone. He learned that contractors quote you one price and hand you another, that the health inspector has opinions about everything, that a walk-in cooler compressor costs more than his first car had. There were nights he sat on an overturned bucket in the gutted kitchen and cried the kind of quiet, tearless crying that men who have to be strong for someone else learn how to do, the kind that happens entirely behind the eyes. There was a night in April when the setback felt bigger than the dream. A late frost cracked one of the old ceiling pipes, and Marcus walked in one morning to find 2 inches of standing water across the floor he had just finished sanding, ruining a week of work in a single freezing night. He stood in the doorway in his work boots, watching his breath fog in the cold, and for the first time since signing the papers, he let himself ask the question he had been refusing to ask. What if this had all been a mistake, born out of grief and pride instead of good sense? He called his sister in Charleston that night, voice cracking in a way he hadn't let it crack since Alicia's funeral, and she reminded him, gently, that their grandmother had flooded twice in 31 years, and reopened both times, before the insurance check even cleared. "Reid women and Reid men don't quit on account of weather," she told him. "We quit on account of giving up, and you haven't done that yet." But the neighborhood noticed him. An older woman named Miss Odessa, who had bought bread from Sal for 40 years, started stopping by just to sit on a folding chair and keep Marcus company while he worked, telling him stories about the old bakery, about Sal's terrible jokes, and his even worse handwriting. A teenager named Darnell, whose mother worked 2 jobs and who had nothing but time after school, started showing up to help haul debris in exchange for whatever sandwich Marcus could put together, and eventually just because he wanted to. A retired electrician named Pop Curtis took one look at Marcus's amateur wiring job, shook his head, and spent the next 3 weekends redoing it properly, refusing every dollar Marcus tried to hand him. "You're feeding this block," Pop Curtis said. "Least I can do is make sure you don't burn it down doing it." Zoe became the bakery's smallest and loudest cheerleader. She named the ancient mixer Big Bertha, after watching it groan through its first batch of dough. She drew a new sign for the window when the old one finally fell apart. All crooked rainbow letters spelling out "Golden Crust" in marker, and Marcus framed it and hung it by the register, where it stayed long after the professional sign went up outside. On the nights when his back ached and his hands were cracked from bleach water and his bank account had 4 digits fewer than it used to, Zoe would climb into his lap at the kitchen table and say, with the absolute certainty only a 9-year-old can offer, "It's going to be the best bakery in the whole city, Daddy. I already know it." Golden Crust reopened on a Saturday morning in late June, 11 weeks after Marcus signed the papers. Miss Odessa was first in line, the way she'd promised. Darnell manned the door in an apron 2 sizes too big, grinning like it was his own grand opening. Pop Curtis stood outside, admiring his wiring like a proud father, and Marcus, hands trembling as he pulled the first tray of his grandmother's honey biscuit recipe from the oven, the one she'd taught him on that overturned milk crate, felt something settle in his chest that 11 years in a corner office job had never once given him. Pride that belonged entirely to him. Customers trickled in all morning. Neighbors he recognized from a decade of driving these streets, without ever really seeing them. Strangers pulled in by the smell of butter and cinnamon drifting out onto the sidewalk. A few of Zoe's classmates and their parents, crowding the little cafe tables Marcus had refinished himself from salvaged church pews. By noon, the display case was nearly empty, and Marcus stood behind the register with flour on his cheek and his daughter's crayon sign glowing gold in the afternoon light, and he thought, for the first time in longer than he could remember, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The first few months were good. Word spread. The honey biscuits became a local legend, written up in a neighborhood blog, then a city paper, then shared enough online that people started driving in from other parts of town just to try them. Marcus hired Darnell part-time for real wages. He hired a young woman named Priya, a laid-off pastry chef with a portfolio full of talent and one willing to take a chance on her resume gap. Golden Crust became, in its own small way, a place that gave people second chances, the way it had given Marcus one. But small business is a knife with 2 edges, and Marcus learned the second one quickly. A large chain coffee and pastry franchise opened 2 blocks away, backed by investors with marketing budgets Marcus couldn't have dreamed of, undercutting his prices on the exact same honey biscuit recipe they'd clearly reverse-engineered from a food blogger's photo. Rent on the building went up when the landlord realized foot traffic had improved. The walk-in cooler compressor, the same one that had eaten his savings during renovation, died, again in the middle of July, and this time, Marcus didn't have the cushion to fix it fast. The chain cafe even ran a promotion offering a free artisan honey biscuit with every large coffee, and Marcus watched 3 of his regulars walk past his own window toward the flashier storefront, and he understood, in a way that stung more than he expected, that this was the same lesson Callaway Foods had tried to teach him, that scale and money could always outshout quality, at least for a little while, at least until people remembered what real tasted like. He didn't have the budget to fight back with advertising, so he did the only thing he knew how to do. He made the biscuits better, the coffee stronger, the counter warmer, and he trusted that a neighborhood built on memory would eventually remember where its loyalty belonged. Then, one morning, he arrived to find the front window shattered and go back to your office job, spray painted in red across the brick, the kind of ugly, anonymous cruelty that exists purely to remind a man that some people cannot stand to watch someone else win. Marcus almost didn't tell Zoe, but she saw the boarded-up window before he could explain it away, and instead of the fear he expected, she looked up at him with her mother's steady eyes and said, "Grandma Ruth didn't quit when things got hard, right? You told me that." Marcus knelt down on the sidewalk in front of his broken window and hugged his daughter so hard. She squeaked, because she was right, and because he needed, more than he needed anything else that week, to be reminded of it by someone who still believed in him, without a single condition attached. The community showed up harder than the Vandals had. Miss Odessa organized a fundraiser through her church. Pop Curtis fixed the window himself and refused, again, to take a dime. Priya redesigned the menu boards for free. Darnell started a social media page for the bakery that, within a month, had more followers than Marcus knew what to do with, filming short videos of the ovens, of Big Bertha groaning through her morning shift, of Zoe sneaking bites of dough when she thought the camera wasn't rolling. Golden Crust didn't just survive the summer. It came out of it stronger, scrappier, more itself than it had ever been. Marcus framed a photo of the boarded-up window next to the crayon sign by the register. not as a trophy of what had been done to him, but as a reminder of what the block had done for him in return. Proof that the community he had bet everything on had bet just as hard on him. It was late September, 6 months after the reopening, when the bell over the door rang on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, and Marcus looked up from the register to see Richard Calloway III standing in the doorway of his bakery. Richard looked different, thinner in the face, older around the eyes, wearing a suit that no longer seemed to fit him the way authority used to fit him. He looked, Marcus realized with a start, almost nervous, glancing around at the chalkboard menu, at Zoe's crayon rainbow sign, still hanging proudly by the register, at the line of regulars who all seemed to know each other's names. "Marcus," Richard said, and his voice didn't have the boardroom polish it used to. "I heard about this place from someone at the gym. I didn't put it together until I walked in and saw you." He paused, and for a moment neither man said anything. The whole bakery holding its breath around them. Callaway Foods restructured again. Board brought in outside leadership after the Western region numbers cratered post-layoffs. "I'm not CEO anymore, Marcus. Haven't been for 3 months. Marcus set down the pastry bag in his hands slowly. Every version of this moment he had imagined in the shower, in the truck, in the quiet after Zoe fell asleep, had involved some kind of satisfaction, some kind of victory lap. Instead, standing there in his flour-dusted apron, all Marcus felt was tired. Tired in the way that comes right before something finally, truly lets go. "I came to say I'm sorry," Richard said. And the words looked like they cost him something to say out loud, in public, to a man he had once dismissed in under 4 minutes. "What I did to you, the way I did it, wasn't business. It was cowardice wearing a suit. You built something out of what I threw away, and I don't think I've ever built anything out of nothing in my whole life. I wouldn't know how to start." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached under the counter, pulled out one of the last honey biscuits from the morning batch, still warm, and set it on a plate in front of Richard. "My grandmother used to say, bread doesn't lie about what it needs," Marcus said. "Time. Warmth. Somebody willing to actually work the dough instead of just watching it rise. I spent 11 years trying to prove I belonged in your building, Richard. Took me getting fired to learn I never needed your building at all." He slid the plate an inch closer. "Eat. On the house. Not because I forgive what happened in that office. I'm still working on that part, if I'm honest with you. But because nobody who walks into Golden Crust leaves hungry. Not even you." Richard sat at the small table by the window, alone, and ate a biscuit made from a recipe passed down by a woman whose hands he'd never once had to think about. In a bakery, built by a man he had once believed didn't matter enough to keep. Outside, the afternoon light hit the brick building at that particular golden angle Marcus had come to think of as the bakeries, the one that turned flour dust drifting through the air into something that looked almost like falling stars. Zoe came in from the back room, apron dusted white to match her father's, and climbed onto the stool behind the counter to watch. She didn't know who the man at the window table was. Not really. Not the whole story of it. She just knew her father was standing taller than she'd seen him stand in a long time, and that the bakery smelled like honey and cinnamon, and something warm enough to fill up every corner of the order. Marcus Reid never got an apology that undid 11 years of being made to feel small. He never got the acknowledgement on record, the LinkedIn post, the public reckoning some part of him had once fantasized about. What he got instead was better, and stranger, and far more his own. A business built from his grandmother's hands and his own too. A daughter who watched her father get knocked down and choose, every single time, to rise again anyway. And a community that had shown up for him in ways no corner office ever had. That night, after closing, Marcus and Zoe sat on the front step of Golden Crust Bakery, eating the last two biscuits of the day, watching the streetlights flicker on over 5th and Larkin. "Dad," Zoe said around a mouthful of biscuit, "are you happy? Like, for real happy? Not just okay happy?" Marcus looked at his daughter, at the shattered window that had been rebuilt stronger, at the crooked crayon sign still hanging proud in the front window. At the whole unlikely, hard-won, honey-warm life he had built out of the wreckage of a 4-minute meeting that was supposed to end him. "Baby," he said, wrapping an arm around her shoulders, "I am for real happy." And somewhere behind them, through the window, the ovens hummed on into the evening, ready for tomorrow's dough, ready for whatever came next, because that is what it means to start over. Not that the hard days disappear, but that you learn, one honest loaf at a time, to build something that is entirely, unmistakably your own. 6 months later, Golden Crust Bakery hired its 4th employee, a retired line cook named Otis, who had been let go from a downtown hotel restaurant after 30 years, and who cried a little, unashamed, on his first morning shift when Marcus handed him an apron and told him this was a place where 30 years of experience still meant something. Miss Odessa's fundraiser money, unused after the community rebuilt the window themselves, became the seed fund for a Saturday program where neighborhood kids could learn to bake for free, and Darnell, no longer a teenager doing chores for sandwiches, became its first instructor. Pop Curtis still comes by every Friday for his black coffee and a day-old biscuit at half price, which Marcus always rings up as free anyway, and the two of them argue, amicably, about whether that counts as charity or just good business. The chain cafe 2 blocks down quietly closed within the year, its investors chasing a newer trend in a newer neighborhood, and nobody at Golden Crust gloated about it, because by then they had stopped measuring their worth against anyone else's storefront. Richard Calloway III came back once more, a few months after that first visit, not as a customer this time, but to ask Marcus, hesitantly, almost shyly, if he could work a single Saturday shift, unpaid, just to understand what it actually felt like to build something with his hands instead of inherit it. Marcus said yes, on one condition. Richard had to let Zoe teach him how to shape a proper dinner roll, because if he was going to learn humility, he might as well learn it from a 9-year-old who had never once needed a corner office to know her own worth. If Marcus's story reminded you that it is never too late to bet on yourself, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe, because we tell stories like this every single week about ordinary people who refuse to stay knocked down. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.